Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Misinformation Podcast. I'm Z, aka the Reluctant Accountant. It's time to get into it. So this episode is being recorded post November 7th, November 6th, the US elections, you know what I'm getting at. And we're looking at another Trump presidency. And many people are really, really shocked, especially because the polls indicated beforehand that the election would be much, much closer. And it turns out that Trump definitely seems to have won by some sort of landslide or a clear majority. And also he's won the popular vote. And so for a lot of us over in the UK, it doesn't make sense for a number of reasons, because A, we don't understand why you would elect Donald Trump again, but also just the kind of US political system, the way that elections work and stuff is very different from what we have over here. And it's very interesting. And the reason I say apparently it appears that he got all the electoral votes that he needed is because there are definitely murmurings. And if you're on Twitter, it's formerly known as Twitter. If you're on X, you will see that some people are starting to ask questions about the count. Now, they're not doing it in the same manner that previously Trump supporters did when they were, banging on doors and storming capitals. But there are definitely questions being asked about the legitimacy of the count from various factions. So by the time this episode comes out, who knows where we'll be. But at the moment, it appears that Donald Trump has again won the presidency and he will become the next president of the United States. Now, all that aside, for the moment, I've found this very interesting and very fascinating, mainly because for a while I've been, interested in listening or following politics around the world, to be honest with you, not just within the UK, but looking at Europe, South America, and the US as well. And I remember coming across or hearing about something ages ago about this strategy that was in place to try and turn America red. Now, if you're unfamiliar with US politics, red is Republican and blue is the Democrats, which is the other way around in the UK. Labour, they would argue that they're more aligned with the Democrats, are red and Conservatives are blue. But anyway, so they were talking about turning the map red, right? And actually there was something called REDMAP, which I'm going to get into. And I'm going to explain, this is something that I feel there is. If you're going to argue that the Democrats are on the left, and I would say that they're not, but I guess they tend to position themselves as more left-leaning, but left of the right isn't necessarily left. We'll get into that another time. But if you're going to think about the right, which I definitely think exists in US politics, more than exists rather, it's very interesting how much they have strategized and played the long game. And you're probably thinking, what are you talking about, Z? What can you actually be talking? What long game? I'm going to get into it and I'm going to explain because it is crazy. And for me, looking at the way we're going with AI and algorithms and all this other technology that we have, it's only going to get worse. And I'm going to explain. So before I get into that, really, really get into that, I think I need to explain for my audience, because I think most of my audience are probably based in the UK, what the US government looks like, what the composition is. Because I think by and large, we understand in this country that we, have MPs that are elected to the House, and those MPs, the most you get, it's first past the post, but if you get enough elected, basically that party will form the new government. That's supposed to be the way that it works over here. There's, a few caveats and whatever. But in the US, their structure is slightly different. So the government in the US is made up of three branches, essentially. In the legislative branch, which is Congress, there are two chambers. You have the House of Representatives and you have the Senate. So the House of Representatives is supposed to be just that, where they're representing the population proportionally. That the Senate, however, is different. Each state gets two senators, doesn't matter how big they are. Every state gets two senators. So Congress which is the legislative branch, is responsible for creating the laws. This is very important to remember. So they are the people that pass the laws or don't pass the laws. Remember that. Then you've got the executive branch, which is the presidency, effectively. So the executive branch is the branch that implements national policy and manage affairs, and they have, they include all the federal agencies. And then the third branch is the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. So their job is to interpret the laws which have been passed by Congress and decide whether they are constitutional or not. The Supreme Court is also supposed to act as a check on other branches to ensure that laws and policies respect the Constitution. So in the US, the federal government shares power with individual state governments, which have their own laws and representatives and powers over certain policies. There is another concept that I have to explain to you before I get into this. So let's just do a quick recap. What we have is 3 branches of government. You have the legislative branch, which is Congress, which has 2 chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. You then have the executive branch, which is the presidency and the federal agencies and such. And then you have the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court, which provides checks to make sure that all the laws are constitutional and in line with the document they signed hundreds of years ago to decide that was the charter for the country. So here's the thing. We need to go back to the legislative branch, Congress. So Congress is made up by a House of Representatives. And where those things come from, they come from the states. The representatives come from the states, people that have been nominated to represent the state. Let's park that for 1 second. I'm going to introduce you to a concept that you may or may not be familiar with, and it's called gerrymandering. What is gerrymandering? I'm glad that you asked. So gerrymandering is essentially the process by which electoral districts are drawn up in a partisan manner to favour one party or another. So, for example, in the US, the state legislature controls the redistricting, don't say that when you're drunk, redistricting process. So that means that the party that's in power at a state level can redraw the lines in their favour, redraw the district lines in their favour. So this means, let's take this a little bit further. I hope you're still following me. And it becomes particularly important when we think about, as I said, the House of Representatives, Congress, the branch that makes the laws, because it means that politicians at a state level can redraw districts to lock in seats and effectively control the House. This essentially makes it easy for one party to maintain control. And some of you are probably thinking, well, how would they even know? Like, how would they know how to redraw the lines? They know essentially also because every 10 years there's a census that is conducted that tells you who lives where, what the population looks like, etc. And that data gives states the opportunity to adjust their district lines. Okay, this may sound all very conspiracy theorist and so on and so forth, but wait, there is more. So, how do we know about any of this? So in 2010, we're going to have to go back 14 years. In 2010, there was a young strategist, a Republican strategist. I'm saying young, I have no idea if he was young at the time, called Chris Jankowski. And Chris was looking at his party and he thought, we can be doing better. We're spending all this money running for Congress at the Congress level, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But you know what? Maybe we need to go smaller. Maybe we need to get into the weeds and start fighting before Congress so that we can change the face of Congress. So he keeps going on about this idea that he has. And he's like, you know what? If we just fight at a very, very local state level and start flipping some seats, we can have a big impact. And so here's where I became familiar with this a few years ago. I was listening to this podcast and it was talking about this place called Blue Hill, Maine. Blue Hill, Maine. I think that's right. And they were talking about this guy. It's a very local town. Local area in the US. I'm saying town, I'm using these words very liberally because I don't know how to, with the districts and towns and whatever. But if you've not heard of Blue Hill, Maine, there's probably a reason. It's in Maine and it's called Blue Hill. That's all I know. And so I heard this story on this podcast about the situation where I think it was this incumbent Democrat that was going for the state legislator, right? And one of the seats. And he just thought, put my hat in. I think Blue Hill has less than 3,000 people in the town or whatever. And he wanted to run for the district to be the state legislator. So he's just doing what he does and, I don't know, making cherry pie or whatever you do in very small places, right? And all of a sudden, there is this like big smear campaign against him. Now, remember, if you've not heard of Blue Hill, Maine, this is because it's so small. It's almost like who would even care about what's going on? That's a good question. So what happened, and this was the big controversy as well. It was said that Jim, his name was Jim, it was said that Jim didn't want to have fireworks on the 4th of July. And, he was, very anti-American or whatever it is, the whole shebang, communist or whatever it was that you throw at people when you're trying to allude to the fact that you believe that they're unpatriotic. So Jim saw all this and he was like, what is happening? Who is doing this? So they looked to his opponent, and his opponent, the Republican, was like, well, I don't know who is doing this. And this stuff was coming out and it was relentless. Now, the irony being that it was true. There was going to be no fireworks on the 4th of July. And Jim did sit on the council, which decided that. But actually, he was the only person that voted to have them. So it wasn't even, a reflection of the truth, and they had blamed him for it. So anyway, his opponent, who I don't remember his name, but I will, if you are watching this rather than listening to it, I will include his name on the screen when I remember it. His opponent tried to figure out who it was, and he didn't know. So his opponent then set about, because this is a nice small town where everybody likes each other and it's, friendly politics, trying to say, look, I like him. He's a good guy. I don't think he did this. This isn't me. Anyway, it was too late. Jim lost and the Republican won. Why did he win? Because what they didn't know, that they were part of a new initiative or strategy that was being rolled out, and spearheaded by this Chris Jankowski, called REDMAP, which basically stood for Redistricting Majority Project. And what the idea was with REDMAP was to go around the country and look at all of these states, but also these very small local elections that were taking place, where there was almost nothing in it, and pour a lot of money into that very hyper-local politics to flip these very, very small seats and turn the tide red. The way that REDMAP worked was essentially two big things that they did. They targeted investment. Now, you think about, I think they were given 30 million for the project, which in political terms is not a lot. But in local terms, in local elections, that's huge amounts that has been put into these things. What they did was the Republican Party, via this REDMAP strategy, heavily invested in key swing states. They focused on local seats where the Democrats were vulnerable. Places where everybody likes everybody. And so it's not as contentious and as big of a fight. So once they did that and had this targeted investment, they then had control of these state legislators, which meant that they could redraw the district lines. And so what they did is they redrew these lines in a way that almost guaranteed future victories for the Republican Party. So they would pack like Democratic voters into a few districts or spread them really thinly so their vote didn't have as much power. So what was the result? Well, the result was that many states ended up with heavily Republican-dominated maps, even when the votes in that state were evenly split between the two parties. So, for instance, in North Carolina, and actually in Wisconsin, Republicans secured a really large majority of the seats, despite Democrats winning close to 50% of the votes statewide. Now think about that. Democrats won almost 50% of the vote, but the Republicans secured large majority of the actual seats. Welcome to gerrymandering. Okay, so what is the impact on the national political landscape? That doesn't mean anything, does it? Like these local elections, it's fine. Like you vote one way local and you let's see. So the effects of REDMAP extended far beyond local politics. Republicans effectively began to control Congress. So, when you hear, if you're in the UK, this may be like, what do they mean? When they have a party in power, so for example, the Democrats may be in power, but they're like, we can't get anything passed because we don't control Congress. Here we are. This is the result of those hyper-local interference, maybe, or manipulation, certainly, of hyper-local politics to favour and change the national political landscape. So by securing Republican majorities in these states, what they effectively were able to do was secure control of Congress. They maintained a strong grip on the House of Representatives. So this obviously affects national politics, and it's easier to push forward a conservative political agenda in that way. Even if you're not in power, when laws are proposed, you can just block them. You can just vote against them. And then it makes the government that's in power seem ineffective. Also, it affects policy outcomes because if they have more seats, Republican lawmakers have less incentive to work with Democrats and offer compromises. Why should they? This also contributes to the polarization in politics, right? When people have to work for their vote, when people have to work for seats, they're more likely to have a bit of give and take. Yes, I'll vote for this bill, but I've got this one that's coming up you support. But if they know they have the majority, if they know they have seats locked in, they're not going to do that. Why do they need to do that? They're like, I'm holding the cards here. This also means when they are in power, if they control Congress and they are in power, they can pass their bills that favor topics and, take positions that they are more comfortable with. So that can be on immigration, that can be on healthcare, that can be on climate change. They will just pass whatever bills that they want to because they control Congress. And in the future, next year, they will control the executive branch as well. And they can have these policies passed and these laws passed and gain traction with little to no opposition. And so there is also an impact on the Senate and the presidency because although gerrymandering directly affects only House seats rather than the Senate, it does have an indirect effect on the national elections. So a strong Republican base in the House helps to build momentum and also public support for conservative candidates in the Senate and also in the Senate races and in the presidential elections. So we haven't finished because there's also the Supreme Court. And if you'll know, because of the, recent repealment of Roe v. Wade, people are looking to the Supreme Court more and more and thinking, what the actual? So how has this affected? How has this gerrymandering affected the Supreme Court? Well, again, it has indirectly shaped the makeup of the Supreme Court, especially during Donald Trump's presidency. So in 2016, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was in her 80s and had been battling cancer. And I would hasten to add, many progressive voices asked her to retire. But no, she didn't. They wanted her to retire during the Obama presidency because whilst you would expect a judicial branch of government to not be partisan at all, that isn't the way that it works in the US because these Supreme Court justices will be elected by the party that's in power. And also they've got job for life, right? So when you become a Supreme Court judge or justice, that's it. That's your job. Unless you retire or you die, those are the only ways that you're getting out of that job, which I don't know, just feels so ridiculous. It just feels like such a ridiculous. Anyway, but that's the way it is. That's the way it is. So people were saying to RBG, listen, hun, retire, get out. Obama's the president. We need you to think about calling it a day, putting a blanket over your legs and just handing the reins over to someone else. And just as an aside, that always fascinates me about the US politics is that there is this huge tendency to go with just old white men, but just old people in general. And I'm not ageist. I like old people. Yeah, that's fine. But it's just a stark contrast to, other nations where people, maybe someone's in their 50s or something, 50s and 60s where they, you've got life experience and professional experience. I feel like hitting your 70s to 80s, that's when you should be winding down for stuff. That's not, God forbid. God forbid. Just about to turn 80, but let me take on a job for a couple. Absolutely not. It sounds horrific. And I don't know if it's to do with, I don't know if there's, and I'm going off on a tangent here, but I don't know if there's some subliminal thing where, there's like this American hustle culture and they're really like, yeah, work, 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 and I'll sleep when I'm dead. I don't know if that's like the epitome of it within their kind of government makeup, but there is definitely this tendency towards, these older, you get in that position and there's no real, I don't know, there's no real kind of assessment that perhaps there is much more value in having, diverse or people that are living a different life. I don't know. Obviously, they're against DEI and stuff. But my point being that, I don't know, it just would feel crazy for me to see like an 80-year-old in the UK running for prime minister and people legitimate, like taking that seriously. I don't know. But anyway, let me get back on course. So RBG doesn't retire. She doesn't retire. And then she lost her battle, as we say, with cancer. She died whilst, guess who was in presidency? No, not Obama. The guy that came after. Yes, Mr. Orange himself, Trump. And so if she had not stayed on the bench, then she could have been replaced with a more democratic or more progressive Supreme Court justice. That didn't happen. Instead, Trump appointed Amy Coney Barrett. I think that's her name. Yes, Amy Coney Barrett, who is a conservative judge. And that shift gave the Supreme Court the Republicans a majority in the Supreme Court, which even just sounds ridiculous. Like, why would you... Anyway, like how in your judicial branch do you have a majority? Anyway, there was a majority and it was 6-3. 6-3, they're whooping your ass. Like, you're not getting things done in the way that you want if it's 6-3. Best don't even bring it to Supreme Court at this point because you know what they're going to say, right? So obviously this has had a profound impact on many things. We've seen like with affirmative action, we've seen with the repealment of Roe v. Wade, which has directly impacted so many rights for women, their reproductive rights. And as a result, tragically, women have been losing their lives because of this. And I don't know. I feel that we are truly living in some peculiar times. And that is not to say, because people will look back and they'll go, oh, they had this, they had the plague and they had the war. The difference that I think we have now is that whilst there could have been in the past that we suspected that governments were corrupt or there was foul play or they were manipulating us, or there wasn't this instantaneous proof in that we can see things. We can, like we've got records of things. And yes, I know that you can manipulate things and so on and so forth, but we have a lot more access today that we didn't have previously. And so the government seems to be running by a playbook that doesn't reflect where we are in the modern world, where we can see that you're lying. Where now we can see that that's happening. And we can see the fallout from the things that you said would benefit us. The Roe v. Wade is something that obviously I know with Kamala's campaign that she was trying to focus on, women's reproductive rights and so on. And one of the things that I find interesting, and I know that I'm, again, going on off a tangent here, but one of the things that I find interesting is that, I saw on social media lots of clips of people speaking to Republican voters, in particular women, and they would say, no, I'm going to vote for Trump because X, Y, and Z. And what I find interesting is because the idea that Republican women are not, for example, in need of women's reproductive health or women's health, healthcare is obviously ridiculous. They do use it, and Republican men. There are a lot of Republican men that will shout from the rooftops, but have probably funded many abortions themselves. But what I find, and I'm not here to put any, I'm not putting Democrats on a pedestal at all. That's not my position. I just want to make that clear. But what I find a lot with, particularly with Republican voters on specific issues, is that I think that they seem to very much embody this idea of, I want the law passed because I don't think it will apply to me. I think they think that they are somehow more deserving of the benefits or the care or whatever it is that, you know, when you're fighting for these rights, I think they're more deserving of those rights. And so they inherently believe that they will be bestowed upon them when the time comes. And that's why there's such a shock when these things come and they're like, oh, but this happened to me and I never thought it would happen to me. And that I just find that really interesting, because people often I'm voting for this so that it applies to you, because it will never apply to me until it does, obviously. So all of that to say this, we are living in a time where a lot of things are changing. There's the big wave in populism. And I truly, truly think that people that identify, for example, as being on the left, and I don't really talk about, like, when I hear this like liberal thing, I feel like liberal is it's like imported from America in terms of like liberal. I don't know. Anyway, but I think the people that are on the left, or people that want more socially progressive policies, for example, they need to start thinking and strategizing in a way that the Republicans do. Republicans and people on the right do. And I say this and I put this out as a warning as well to people in the UK. I've been saying this on social media and I'll say this again here. In the UK and in Europe in general, we tend to think that like we're above certain things, right? We have this notion that couldn't happen here. Like, God, look at them in America, like what's wrong with them or whatever. And I think that's fundamentally a flawed basis from which to start doing or taking any action or doing anything. There are disenfranchised people around this country. When I first started recording these episodes, it was doing it off the back of, summer 2024 and off the back of the race riots that we saw across the country. Here's the thing. We need to think about, whether we like it or not, how to address issues that serve people, also like real issues. I'm not talking about when they want to control other people's bodies, but I mean real issues, particularly in terms of economics and stuff, that seem to affect people that we don't necessarily agree with. Because if you don't address them, if we don't address them, if we don't think about those things and try to get those things in place, a populist person with what people call charisma, I wouldn't say, will come along and pretend to those people that I'm like you and I will address those issues for you, and we will all suffer as a result. And I say that because I think there is this ignorance that we have in this country. And when, Labour just got voted in and everyone feels like patting themselves on the back and they're like, oh, Labour are here, after 14 years of Tory ridiculousness, we've got Labour. And we do, but we got Labour because Reform split the Conservative vote. So in this country, we think we're kind of a little bit superior, but for 14 years, the Tories have decimated our public services. They've woefully managed the country. They've been corrupt. They've lied on our faces. They've done all of these things, and they still had a chance. If Reform didn't come and split that vote, they still would have had a chance of getting in. And why are Reform splitting that vote? I'm not going to get too much into it, but I want you to think about that. I want you to think about that when we are having these discussions, because I think we tend to be very binary on things, and this is good and this is bad. And I think we need to find common issues, because there are common issues that we can address with people and populations that we don't necessarily like. And I'm not saying ones that forsake our humanity or our, morality and stuff like that. But I think there are some economic issues that need to be addressed. There are other social issues that need to be addressed. And I think if we can try to approach those, with, a bit more dispassionately and thinking about the other perspective, I'm not saying that you can change people's mind about everything, but you can at least try to encourage people to have something to vote for rather than always having something to vote against. Oh, there was one other example that I had. This is for the UK people. So I was thinking about this and this has popped into my head completely out of order. So going back to the subject of this episode was the idea about like this House of Representatives, how this has been affected. So let me explain quickly. Say I have a place like, I don't know, Ohio. I'm not making up that's a real place. But say they have 14 seats available for the House of Representatives, right? So what happens is if I'm like, at the moment there is it's 8 to the Democrats and we've got, 6 with the Republicans. And say I think, I think I can get 4 of those seats. That's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to get 4 of those districts to flip from Democrat to Republican. So I do that. I go in and I'm like, let me just go in and just tinker a little bit around with the 4 districts that are kind of teetering on that, and we flip it. And now all of a sudden it's 10 Republican and there's 4 with the Democrats, and that state's effectively gone red. When we're going for like Senate and stuff like that, we now have a red momentum in that state in order to push that through and get the Senate members elected, so Republican Senate, but also it would then impact the electoral college. So when we're going for presidency, how that works would be that those 10 Republican districts we'll just need to keep that momentum going, and it's easier to keep the momentum going and get them vote. You already voted Republican. Like, we have the same things, we have the same ideals. And so that's how it filters up. So also electoral college votes aren't necessarily the same number of seats that district has. So just putting that out there. And that is that. That is all I've got time for today. I just want to thank you once again for being here and joining me on this journey. Just a heads up, so what I will be doing, I don't even know what episode we're at now. It's about 13, I think. So I think we're going to end just before Christmas, and then we're going to pick this up again in the new year. But in the meantime, if you would like to find me, I am, as I say, on social media. The Reluctant Accountant, that's at The Reluctant Accountant. That is on TikTok and on Instagram. And if you want to get in touch, you can email me, themisinformationpodcast@gmail.com, themisinformationpodcast@gmail.com. And that's it. Thank you.